This now? Yeah, great. So, hello everyone, and welcome to our event looking at a just transition in the education sector. My name is Antonia Wolf. I'm the Director of Research, Policy and Advocacy at Education International, which is the global federation of teacher unions, representing about 32 million teachers across the globe. A just transition is or aims to put justice and equity at the center of the greening of our economy. So it seeks to bring together environmental concerns with concerns for human rights and labor rights, ensuring that as we are decarbonizing, taking climate action, we also ensure decent work, human rights, and that nobody is left behind. And at this moment, I also want to recognize that now at 11 a.m. today, there is an action to honor environmental defenders, human rights defenders, and I just want to state very clearly that climate justice builds on human rights, and it's in that spirit that this event is also being organized. So teaching and education workers, usually we think of teaching as essentially a green job. You know, even as we are decarbonizing, we are greening our economies, there will still be a need for teachers. However, the climate crisis is not leaving the education sector untouched. The education sector, students, teachers, education workers are very, very much impacted by the climate crisis. And what we're trying to do here today is understanding what that looks like and how we could seek to advance a just transition in the education sector. We're going to do this with the help of a fabulous panel. And I'm going to briefly introduce you to all of them. Right next to me is Joy Hernandez, who works with the ITUC in the Asia Pacific region. The ITUC is the International Trade Union Confederation. Next to Joy, we have Jenny Cooper from the National Education Union in the UK. And then we have Sifiso Ndlovu from the Zimbabwe Teachers Association. And we will, in just a little while, be joined by Mitzi Jonelle Tan, who is from the Philippines, active in the Fridays for Future Philippines. So we have quite a perfect setup for a conversation about a just transition in the education sector. We are, however, going to start by hearing from some of our colleagues, teachers who couldn't be with us here at COP. So we're going to have a quick video hearing from colleagues in Fiji, New Zealand, and Argentina. The anticipation is building, eh?
Most educators are teaching in islands that are daily affected by sea level rise and other environmental destruction associated with climate change. Families have been relocated due to rising sea level, forcing the children to enroll in other schools. Therefore, they are forced to adapt to new culture and adjust to their lifestyles. Due to natural disasters, schools are damaged and families and communities are affected. Thus, resources are destroyed. We believe a just transition requires state intervention to ensure that necessary social protection and preservation of fundamental rights is maintained while moving into new areas of livelihood. As educators, we must ensure that families are compelled to relocate, transit into new work environments, are adequately resourced, and children have full access to quality education.
So if we're talking about what's happening with communities, particularly the communities that live along the coastline of Hawaii, yes, there are storms, yes, there is flooding, and yes, the sea level is rising. But actually, culturally, it affects Māori very intimately because most of our marae, most of the places where we gather, are very much on the coastline. And to move those places, and in some places, move all of our wāhi tapu, which is where our people are buried, to higher ground is a huge undertaking.
The pathway forward for a coherent response to the climate change issue that we face is looking for solutions that are grounded in Māori worldview. Instilling that concept of paitiakitanga in our children where they feel guardianship over the environment. The big shift that we need to make here in Aotearoa is around shifting climate education away from something that is being done on the goodwill of individual teachers to a much more comprehensive climate change education curriculum. We know that along with what we're doing in classrooms around the country, it's also around how the education sector itself is taking a leadership responsibility, and that means looking to decarbonise the entire sector.
Desde la CETERA venimos trabajando justamente la problemática ambiental desde hace muchos años y creemos que hay muchas acciones para realizar. Una, por ejemplo, es la formación docente permanente, es decir, formarnos en las problemáticas y los conflictos ambientales para hacer de sus ciudadanos protagonistas de la lucha y poder tomar conciencia nosotros y nosotras como trabajadores y trabajadoras, pero también trabajar en nuestras escuelas por la toma de conciencia y la importancia de ir hacia una transición justa.
We thank our colleagues in Fiji, New Zealand and Argentina, and with that we're also going to get started with the panel here. So what I'd like us to first look at is the impact of the climate crisis on students, teachers, education support personnel, school buildings, education systems more broadly. And I thought maybe, Sifiso, would you be okay starting?
Thank you very much, Antonia. The issue that we raise of climate justice is critical. And in Zimbabwe, if I may start from there, I would like to share that our experiences from a country that is landlocked. In other words, we're not surrounded by any seas. We don't have masses of water around us. But we did experience very serious downpour from a cyclone that fell in the country and affected most of our eastern districts. This was the first, in my experience, in the last 60 years, we have not had something like that. And what did we see as an effect of climate change on schools? During that rainy time, we lost 120 learners who were washed away by water in schools. 120 learners were washed away by water. These were children from ECD up to advanced level, which is a secondary exit level for us, Form 6. We saw the destruction of school infrastructure. Classrooms were taken away, washed away. Teachers' houses were literally lifted, the whole house washed away completely, and you could not detect where it was after the rain. That means the whole property, the household, was gone. Livestock was washed away, meaning the teacher was left with only what they were wearing on the day of the rain, and some were served by well-wishers, and they were hanging on trees, and many others surviving. That was during school time. Very traumatic indeed, and very destructive. That then increased a challenge on the health facilities because they were also affected. So we had so many of these waterborne diseases now coming to visit the community after the storm. Let alone food production. We lost vast of lands which were used for producing food. And obviously, income and investment was lost. So poverty, in real terms, visited. We call them the survivors, not victims anymore. Poverty visited the survivors of the cyclone. That became very bad. Effectively then, with this having social impact all around us. After the storm, learners could not come back to school. Most learners could not come back to school. What did we see? We saw some people now feasting on vulnerable learners, going in for prostitution, and also proposing love to young girls, having some early marriages. You know, it's now the issue of security that is now being sought by the learner, because at home there's no food, there's no other way of survival, and somebody who thinks they can provide you that security now comes in. That kind of experience was a serious social impact in the living standards of our communities, let alone the psychological effects that it played on the minds of our learners. The economic downturn was bad because what it meant that obviously there was no production in the area, there was no economic activity, and that clearly was affecting the national GDP in a sense. Well, there was a result of that storm, migration, people moving to higher lands to look for safety, and that created displacement, which was a challenge. Well, we had so many other effects that affected the learners who came to school. Their performance was not good. Why? They were hungry. Why? They had lost teaching and learning time. And so this was a terrible effect on our schools. So these are the injustices that are visited on us by the concept of climate change, and now bringing out that level of injustice to us. I think your question was, what effect? And these are just the effects, and the impacts were socially wide and across. I'll end there. Thank you.
That's great, Sifiso, and a very, very good way of connecting the right to education to gender justice, environmental justice, the fight against poverty, social protection. And let me take this moment to welcome Mitzi, who's now joined us on the panel. You've been introduced to everyone in your absence, so they all know who you are. And I'm going to save you to the end of the panel so that you hear the reflections of your colleagues on the panel. And I'm wondering, Jenny, your thoughts around the impact of the climate crisis on students, teachers, schools.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Before I do that, I do want to just say I'm very aware that this is a global north perspective that I'm coming from, and any experience that we felt in the UK pales into insignificance next to what Sofiso and other colleagues have experienced in the global south. And what I feel is that the policies of our government, which are using a broken system of economics, which favour growth of big business and the big polluters against the development of public services and things, first of all impacted on the global south, but are now at the point where it's beginning to impact on their own people as well. And when you bear in mind that a government's first responsibility is towards keeping its citizens safe, that's beginning to slip away as well. So just a few examples of what's been happening in our schools. So we've had more and more frequent storms than we ever had in the UK before, and it's becoming more frequent that those storms will take out power lines across a bigger area and be taken out for longer, so the infrastructure is not fixed as quickly. So obviously what that means is that schools can't operate for several days at a time in certain regions. We experienced that during the pandemic when our schools were locked down because of COVID, and we were teaching online using Zoom and other platforms. And obviously Zoom and the other platforms didn't work because there was no power, so there was no education at all. For us, we worry about the safeguarding of our children in that situation, and we teach many children, particularly in inner city areas, who have many siblings in one family, and they're living in kind of substandard accommodation, again due to our so-called trickle-down economics system, and you don't know if those children are safe. If you don't see them every day, you don't see them coming to school, and you're not even able to log in on Zoom and say hello to them for days at a time, what's happening to those children? Are they at risk? We had record-breaking temperatures in the UK this July, so about a week or 2 weeks before the schools were due to break up for summer. And because we're a temperate country, our schools are not designed for extreme heat. So quite a lot of our schools are built with, like the glass there, just complete glass walls. That's the newer buildings. The older ones don't have kind of thick walls. We've got a lot of buildings that were built intended to be temporary in the 1970s, kind of clad with asbestos and things. And, you know, they don't stand up to heat or to extreme cold or to flood. So during the heat waves that we had this summer, a lot of schools ended up closing. Some closed for one day, some ended up closing for a whole week. So again, following a year where children had extended periods out of school due to the pandemic, they were then out of school again due to the heat wave. Where schools did stay open, and lots of them, including my own one, made the decision to stay open because we felt that our staff and children were actually safer in the school building than they were in the flats that they were living in. Where they did stay open, it was impossible to operate our usual curriculum because you couldn't have worked in that heat. So whatever the temperature was outside, it was, you know, up to 10 degrees warmer in a crowded classroom. And because of the failure of our government to put enough funding into schools, we've got bigger and bigger class sizes and smaller rooms for the number of children, and obviously more bodies in a warm room makes it even warmer. So that meant that rather than following the normal curriculum, children were kind of sitting around watching films, eating ice lollies. They quite enjoyed it, but I don't know if they're going to enjoy the results that they get once they go through their exams. And that's obviously stressful for us as teachers as well. So the other kind of indirect effect, I suppose, on schools is things, well, on the workforce, is things like we had a couple of days where the London Underground system flooded. We were very lucky, actually, because it flooded at going home time. So you could do your day's teaching at school and then just get stuck for hours, not get home till midnight, and then still go to work the next day. Had that been at morning rush hour, none of the workforce would have got to school. I mean, lots of our schools, everybody takes public transport in London, and people wouldn't have got there. The children might not have got there either, but if the children had got there and the workforce hadn't have got there, who was going to look after them? But from our members' point of view, because of poor sort of policies regarding our rights in some schools, it would mean that people would have their pay docked for the day because they didn't make it to work. And if they don't get paid that day, they then can't pay their rent at the end of the month. So those are the kind of issues that are affecting our members. The other thing is, in general, in relation to storms, flooding, heat waves, and all the rest of it, as I said before, our buildings are not resilient to the kind of weather that we're experiencing with global warming. And what we think is needed as a union is for our buildings to be retrofitted to make them, you know, resilient to what we're experiencing. Not that that's an acceptance that it's too late anyway and, you know, climate change is going to happen, but climate change is happening and has already happened, and the buildings are lagging behind. So I think that's pretty urgent. And can I just very quickly tell one more story? I know it's not directly related to climate change, but I would say it's directly related to the kind of ecological emergency and the way that society or the world is kind of living on the planet nowadays. And that's, we had a little girl aged 9, you might have heard about her, Ella Kissy Deborah, and her mother is a teacher in London, and her daughter, who was aged 9, had asthma. And she was walking to school along one of the busy roads in London every day for years, and gradually her asthma got worse and worse, and she got more and more bad asthma attacks where she was hospitalised, and just she eventually died during an asthma attack. And just this year, for the first time, the court in the High Court has designated that her death was caused by air pollution, and that's the first time legally that that's happened in our country. But what we know is that children everywhere are experiencing that pollution, and they're not only experiencing it where they live, but they're experiencing it in their school playgrounds. And we have some playgrounds that on certain days of the year in London have to be closed off to the children because the air pollution levels are too high to be deemed safe for them to go out there. And to me, it's a basic human right that you breathe clean air and also that you have space to play as a child, and that's gone.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jenny. How, if we look at it from a kind of broader workers' point of view, Joy, what would be your reflections on the impact of the crisis currently?
Reflecting on the crisis, looking at the perspective of the broader workers movement, I think it is very important to look at the situation of the education workers themselves, because in the region where I work in Asia Pacific, a lot of workers are under precarious conditions, and education workers are not exempted from that kind of precarious work. So they don't have security of tenure. A lot of teachers are underpaid, and they take up a lot of work as well, on top of their work as educators. So On the question on the impacts of climate change, particularly on the education system as well as on the education workers, I think it is important to pick up from what they have said earlier as well on how it is affecting the workers themselves. In Asia and the Pacific, I came from the Philippines, and in the Philippines, we experience a lot of typhoons every year. And in every typhoon, when typhoons happen, those who were affected were displaced from their homes. And the main evacuation centers are the schools. So it's the schools that would house people who gets displaced from their homes. So these schools become, these schools would stop operating, or sometimes they would operate alongside these evacuees. So for instance, it was very long time ago, I documented this case study in one of the regions in the Philippines that's frequented by a typhoon. And in that region, they experienced a strong typhoon, and the evacuees stayed in the classrooms for over 12 months. So during the day, it's a classroom, but during the night, families would be staying in the classroom. So there are a lot of impacts in that. There will be a lot of health-related issues as well, because it's affecting not only those who were displaced, but also the students themselves. And in cases like this, education workers, teachers were also called upon to volunteer and provide their services in disaster response, as well as in humanitarian actions. So it's another burden on the workers who are, on top of it, also victims of the climate crisis. Of course, we also have a lot of stories about closures of schools coming from not only typhoons, but also sea level rise. We have a video earlier about Fiji. And in some schools in Fiji, there are permanent closures of schools because of the sea level rise. And these closure of schools would also have impacts on the workers, particularly teachers, who would be losing their jobs. It will result in climate migration. And how do we ensure that education workers are also secured to have another job to wherever they would go? And I think in reflecting in all of this, I think it is very important to realize and to highlight that even without the climate crisis, the education sector has been in dire, state, particularly in the developing countries in Asia and the Pacific. There has been a dire underinvestment in teachers and in the education sector. The education sector has been underfunded. And this is due to a lot of austerity measures, privatization, and also other neoliberal policies that have affected the education sector and the education workers. I think it's very important to see that, because without the climate crisis, our education system is already not resilient. The ratio between teachers and students is very low. Facilities and infrastructures, such as schools and other facilities, are not equipped for just the basic requirements of education. And then we expect the education sector to absorb the shocks of the climate impacts as well. They become evacuation centers. They become the refuge for those who are displaced. And I think it is time that this has to be recognized and to increase the investment in the education sector. Because at the end of the day, how can we achieve or accelerate the progress in SDG 4 on quality education for all when, again, without the climate crisis, we are in this poor state of education system, and you add the impacts of climate change to that, you know, the progress would be much slower. So I think it is very important to highlight that. And as unions, as workers, of course, we support the call for a just transition in all sectors, including the education sector.
That's great. Thanks so much, Joy. And Mitzi, you're also from the Philippines, but you're also coming to the conversation with more of a student perspective. What does the climate crisis look like from your point of view?
The way that I learned about climate change when I was growing up was very technical and alienating and westernized. It talked about the melting ice caps and the polar bears and not about what we were experiencing as a country and as a community. Much later, now I'm seeing more and more educators change the way that they're teaching the climate crisis, but it's not institutionalized. So in the cities where resources are available, in areas where teachers care about it, then it's possible. But then for a lot of places, it's still that very westernized way of teaching where it's taught in science class as a fact and not something that has to be changed. We are not given the tools to become activists. We are not empowered to know that it's the fossil fuel industry that's causing the climate crisis. They tell us that the solutions that we can do as children and as young people is reduce, reuse, recycle, and turn the lights off. And we are reduced to that all we can do is individual lifestyle change. We are not taught that we are able to change the system together collectively as a community because the education system is colonialized. It's neoliberal. It's repressive. It's not teaching us how to change the system because it is something that is born out of the system. And we see this in smallest things. Of course, everyone's already talked about the impacts of the climate crisis when there are floods, the evacuation centers of schools. But it's also how our government shifted the academic calendar. We used to be it's been so long ago that I don't remember, from June to March. And then, because our summer is April, May, and it rains during June, July, but it's manageable rain. They shifted it to August to May to go along with the global education calendar. Well, really, it's not global. It's the Western education calendar. It's the U.S.'s education calendar. To globalize. But what does that mean is that the strongest storm and typhoon season, that's when we start school. It means that children are in school during the hottest time of the year. And that leads to heat waves, that leads to heat strokes, that leads to children not being able to focus in class because we want to be outside in the summer. You know, it's these smallest things where you see that they don't think about the climate crisis at all when talking about the educational system, both in teaching it, both in ensuring the proper measures and structures, but also with our teachers. As she was already mentioning earlier, there is no hazard pay for our teachers, and that's part of loss and damage, climate finance, and reparations, right? But with that topic, it's so difficult to understand. Even if you understand English, the things happening inside this COP with the negotiations, it's so difficult to grasp because it's so technical. What more the people who aren't given the tools to learn about this? What more the people who don't have English as a form of language? And that's another thing where our education is, a lot of it is in English. And when you translate climate change into Filipino, it just says change of weather, not climate. It's not something that you associate to the climate crisis and the global average temperatures. It's just the weather is changing. And that doesn't encapsulate and grasp what's happening. And without that climate education, without that climate awareness, there can be no action. Because if you do not know what's happening, then how can you act? And so it is so crucial that the first step of climate adaptation is proper empowered climate education. Because that's how you ensure that there are people and young people who are able to actively participate in policy-making decisions. And it's not just the students. It has to also be the communities. A lot of our work with YACAP, Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, is creating climate modules for marginalized communities that's contextualized to their experience. But these are young people doing this with a few experts guiding us. Imagine the impact if we could do this institutionalized. Imagine if people and the government was supporting these initiatives and these efforts. And I've talked to some teachers where their islands have been consumed by storm surges. And the way that they teach climate change, they teach it in every subject. It's not just a science topic. Their English class, it's their essay topic. Their math class, it's the percentages of, it depends on the grade, of course. But they do that, they told me they also do that because they have no choice but to put all the subjects together, because they have such limited time when teaching students, because some of their buildings were destroyed because of the storms. But you can see that that's how we should be teaching climate change, and not just climate justice, but also social justice, where they're not grouped and boxed into certain subjects, but rather seeing the holistic point of view of it, because that's how we empower students and young people to become future leaders of tomorrow. Because if we're only trained to focus on certain things, and I could rant about education so much, because I was originally an education rights activist. I still am, of course, but I've now gone more into climate. But it's also how in university, they've now removed social sciences from the hard sciences, because we used to be able to, in my university, we used to be required to take social science classes along our hard science classes. But now they're like, nope, now you're just going to specialize in mathematics and engineering and whatever technical course, which means we have scientists. Hello? Which means that we have scientists that don't talk about the social aspect of things, which means we have climate scientists. No worries. Which means in the future we have climate scientists who don't talk about the impacts of people, who don't see the social issues connected to it. And so it's so crucial that really in every aspect of our education, we are taught what the climate crisis is, who is causing it, and something that we're trying to plan with young people especially, and as a way to organize students, is to get students to sign on to a fossil-free pledge, which means that they will never work for the fossil fuel industry. And we're going to be targeting engineering students, science students, branding students, marketing students, every single course, every single field of study, because that's how we threaten them. Because when people stop, of course there's also the privilege of being able to choose your job, etc. But when young people who are able to choose to stay away from the fossil fuel industry, then there's power in that. And sorry, one last thing. I think something that's really powerful for the education system to do is the divestment campaign, where students get their universities to stop investing in fossil fuels, because there's something wicked with how you are paying for your university to invest in your future, and they invest your money into something that destroys your future. And so there's something so convoluted and evil, really, in the way that universities put your money, your parents' money, your family's money into something that will destroy you. And they don't even tell us about it, right?
Absolutely, and Joy was talking about how underfunded public education is today. We know that there are many countries that invest more in fossil fuel subsidies than they do in public education. That's an outrage in itself. And it's interesting listening to the panel here. It really reminds me of many of the conversations we've had during COVID, discussing the impact of school closures, the impact of a health emergency on students, teachers, our well-being, and how we have a climate crisis that is doing very much the same, but we have not yet started talking about it in the same way, recognizing that in some communities, the climate crisis is regularly closing schools for very, very long periods of time. And many of you touched upon also solutions and what we do looking at a just transition in the education space. How do we ensure rights, the rights of students, the rights of teachers, the right to decent work, as we decarbonize and take climate action? Maybe Sifiso, do you want to start? And if we try to keep it to about 3 minutes, I know there's so much to say.
Okay, thank you. As we're speaking here, I then came to think, what are we talking about when we talk of climate change? And then what are we talking about when we talk of just transition and in education? I then came up to look at the issue of renewable energies in our schools and in our communities. And I then said, where is the knowledge about that resident? Then I said, the just transition is an issue that is geocentric. So it is important that we look at the geography where it is happening. It is important to look at the indigenous knowledge systems. What are the problems in that area? And to me, that is where we miss the point at times when we forget about the geocentric wisdom that must come into addressing climate justice. This brings me to a point where we talk about climate transition from a perspective of saying, what were the root causes of climate injustice? Yes, there could be reasons that have to deal with the climate, but the transition, what are the injustices, root causes? We may find that in some elements, we find colonization, like we have already said, as an issue, which is a root problem for a just transition to happen. I give this because people think colonization has ended. Yes, it has ended, but it has legacies that we must address. And in Zimbabwe, as an example, when we talk of the ownership of things, the land and things like that, we are talking about the legacies of colonization. And the people who must now have the land to be used for that production don't own it. And that is where now we have to talk about who is the owner of that land. So appropriately, therefore, to situate the debate around carbon reduction, we need to look at the issues of colonization. Who in the first place is exploiting the resources that bring about this carbon problem? And who then must then deal with the issue of reparation? This is very important. And if we ignore that element, then schools that are vulnerable to weather patterns and climate change suffer because nobody comes to their rescue. They are poor. It is their problem. They are poor. They must solve it. If they are poor, why? Because in the first place, they did not get the right start. So we're leaving them behind continuously. Now climate change is adding the problem, which has started with colonization in terms of empowerment. That cannot really be ignored. So that's an issue. Then when we address it, climate justice now becomes entwined into the economy. Climate justice now becomes entwined into the ecology that we are operating in. Climate justice becomes entwined into the humanity that we're talking about. Then it becomes a human rights issue. And who is abusing the human rights in that element? Then we have to address that element. So schools, before we can even talk about assisting them, let's address that issue in transition. It will help us go forward.
Great, thanks, Ifiso. And Jenny, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so 3 points. I'll try and do a minute each if I can, and I'll try and make it different from what everyone else has said, even though I agree with all of it. So 3 things that could be done. I mean, as a trade unionist, always we think, is this something we can act on collectively? And we already have. So, you know, during the pandemic, we acted collectively to get safety protections in place in our schools for the staff and for the students. And that worked. In places where people were prepared to kind of, you know, speak out with the power of knowing they had their fellow union members there with them, you know, acting together, they did get positive changes in place. And that also happened during the extreme heat waves we had, where, you know, members were coming together in our schools to kind of lobby the management, you know, to argue for this bit of the curriculum to be relaxed, the uniform to be relaxed, the school to be closed if necessary, parts of the school to be closed, people to be moved to a different location. And that happened where people acted collectively together. And again, we had a school in the northeast of England that was built new on a floodplain. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, in a climate emergency? And it flooded dramatically, you know, right up above the levels of the desks in the classroom. And staff were asked to go into the flood, wade through the floodwaters and save the resources so that they could then move to another hall somewhere to do the teaching. And they contacted us as union representatives and said, is this okay that we're being asked to do this? Here's a video of what's happening, and got sent a film by WhatsApp, and you could literally hear the gushing water that this person was about to wade through. And we all said, no, don't go there, get together with the members. And then obviously we saved them and they didn't go in. So collective action, that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think really important as trade unionists that we link the climate emergency with health and safety. So we have a long and proud tradition of acting on health and safety in our trade unions to protect our members and protect the workforce and to bring changes about to things like asbestos. I know it hasn't happened in every country and there's still work to do, but you know, all sorts of other health and safety measures. So to link health and safety and to make our members and governments and councils and managers and everybody understand that climate change is an issue that affects the health and safety of our workforce. And then the third point is around youth activism and the decolonising and decarbonising of the curriculum. I don't actually think there's a difference between decolonising the curriculum and decarbonising the curriculum, because Safiso has explained really well how the two link up. They are one and the same thing. And part of changing that curriculum is to educate people that they're one and the same thing and what the cause is. And in many countries, that's not happened. So what's happened in the UK recently is that the government has produced some political impartiality guidance for teachers, which means that we're not allowed to mention things like Extinction Rebellion, even though a large number of our members are members of that organisation and go out alongside youth campaigning on climate justice. But we need to fight that. We can't just accept those things. Again, we have to act collectively to get those things changed. Just one little example, your thing about being taught about polar bears and not about what was happening in your own place. It was only when the film was released at the cinema called Peterloo that I knew that there was the start of a revolution in England that never quite happened because they were all killed to stop it happening. I was never taught that at school. I only found out 10 years ago or something, and I'm 55. So it happens everywhere. Thanks.
It really does. And I wonder actually, if before we go on to Joy, if we can go to Mitzi, because I think there were some links between your reflections, Mitzi, earlier, and Jenny's reflections around professional autonomy and the ways in which teachers are forbidden from doing the teaching and learning that would be absolutely essential at this time. So over to you, Mitzi.
I think teachers should team up with students. I was a student activist. I've graduated now, but I was a student activist, and I've seen how a lot of students sometimes think the teachers are their enemies because they're the ones who are right there in front of them, when really it's a systemic thing, and our teachers should be our allies. I'm so happy that there are teacher activists alongside me here, but there are some teachers who are a little bit less progressive, right? And we have to admit that. But these aren't the teachers that these aren't the people that they should be attacking. Instead, they should be talking to them, getting them connected with other teacher activists so that we're all one network and one group together. I think something that is so important for teachers to know and understand is that teaching people that systemic change is the solution is one of the most important things that you could do. I know some activists who became activists because of their teachers. Because in small ways and forms, they were able to insert, like, oh, here's a resource video that you can watch outside of class. And then it's a thing. Or, oh, if it's a journal, I've had a lot of writing classes where they had the students cover protests. And of course, when the students are there, they'll learn because they have to listen, they have to write about it, they have to research. It is so important that children are empowered, that young people are empowered with this information and this crucial education. It doesn't even have to be about climate change right now. Really, it has to be about that systemic change, about that anti-colonialization, about that anti-imperialism, because that will always link to the climate crisis later on. But once people, you can talk about climate action, but what we need is climate justice, and that's what we need teachers to be doing.
Absolutely. And now moving to you, Joy, what are your thoughts around what a just transition would look like in the education sector specifically?
Reflecting on what we have discussed earlier, I was thinking that, historically, when trade union movement fought for the concept of just transition, we were thinking of workers in the fossil fuel industry who needs to transition into low carbon economy and how they will be affected, during the process of transition. But then now it goes beyond that. We see how climate change has affected other sectors as well, but in a different way. You have mentioned that teachers or teaching is a green job. It means that you don't emit a lot of greenhouse gases and everything. But it doesn't mean that there should be no transition that should happen. And I think the kind of just transition transition for teachers would look something like unions of education workers at the seat of negotiating table when it comes to just transition plans. Just transition plans integrating the concerns of the education sector. As I said earlier, education workers are at the front lines of the climate emergency, not only because of their jobs as teachers, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the additional burden that they take on during these times of disasters. And I think that kind of lived experiences of teachers could be an important way for them to really give a lot of inputs when it comes to just transition planning. And so I think unions must be really recognized as social partners, in identifying what kind of just transition would look like for the education sector. I think it's also important, especially among the trade union movement, we have always been pushing for social protection for workers. And with the kind of vulnerabilities that workers and students are facing, as well as the communities around schools and communities, we see how important social protection is now, especially in the context of climate adaptation in terms of loss and damage. That's why this has to be financed as well, and this has to be financed in a just way. Another way is, when Mitzi talked about allies and having teacher activists, I think unions must continue to organize, because I think unions has this broader perspective of what's going on. We are trying to look beyond our situation as workers, or just beyond teaching. We look into the economic, policies, how it's affecting everyone. We look at the environmental policies. We look at the socio-economic policies as well. And I think, the more teachers we organize, the more allies students can have, the more voice we could have when it comes to collective bargaining, when it comes to having a voice at the seat of the negotiating table. And lastly, I think when we mention about integrating climate change in the curriculum, making it part of the discussions, making it part of what's being taught in school. I think we've mentioned also about climate justice. We have to teach about rights as well. We have to teach about, you know, justice principles as well. And I think this has been overly lacking. I became a trade union activist by accident. I didn't know my rights as a worker when I was a student. When I entered the labor market, I felt so exploited. And I thought, my initial thinking actually was not to become a unionist. I thought, oh, I should explore how the Human Resources Department could work or better for, you know, our employees. And then later on, I studied industrial relations, and I specialized in labor policies. And then I was like shocked. Oh, this human resource is not the way to go. We have to organize ourselves. I did not think about that when I left my job, you know. And I think it's the kind of education also that we have to teach the students, you know, those that will affect our everyday life. And I think, you know, climate change has been affecting us. The precarious conditions of our workers has been affecting us as well. And I think it's time to end that, and through our collective action.
That's great, and I dare to claim that maybe collective action is the summary of the conversation that we've had here. The power in collective action, the power in bringing together organized movements of students, of teachers, knowing that working together we can make a difference. And just an attempt to summarize some of the key recommendations made by this amazing panel. Health and safety as an old union principle, rights at work, knowing that teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. So if we are serious about the right to education, we need to dare to look at health and safety as an essential pillar of workers' rights. We need to decolonize and we need to decarbonize the curriculum. I loved Jenny's reflection that maybe they are basically one and the same. They go hand in hand, depend on each other. And Sifiso's reminder that we are in this mess not because of everybody having contributed equally, but because of a very clear set of structures of inequality at the very heart of the climate crisis. If this can't be acknowledged in classrooms, we've failed a whole generation of students, and we're not realizing the right to education. So we need to fight for that right of teachers to professional autonomy and of teachers and students to look at what some may think are controversial issues. The right to look at issues around justice and climate justice. What does it look like? And then Joy had an interesting comment about teaching essentially being a green job. And I'm wondering, can we claim that teaching is a green job if we aren't teaching climate justice? If we aren't teaching all those skills for a decarbonization, all of those skills, all of that critical inquiry that we will need for climate justice to be possible. The fifth member of our panel has been the climate clock that is seated here in between Jenny and Joy, and it's reminding us of the absolute urgency that we are faced with. So a big thank you for having joined us today, and an even bigger thank you in advance for all that you are doing and will continue to do for climate justice. Thank you so much.